Okay.
We're live.
All right, and we are live. Thank you all for joining us. If you're coming to the Census Fidelium YouTube channel, my name is Ryan Grant, and I'm joined today by the critic who is a cynic, Odin from OMB Reviews, and Dr. Anthony Stine from Return to Tradition. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Yeah.
You are welcome. And so this December was the 20th anniversary of the theatrical release of Lord of the Rings, and at least starting with the Fellowship of the Ring, and that got me thinking that with certain events coming in the future, it might be good to talk about those specific films, what made them such a phenomenon, such a success, as well as other things, Tolkien, book lore, and especially the Catholic faith that inspired them, among other things. So, first off, I guess Dr. Stein, let's start with you. When did you first encounter the films? When did you first encounter anything about Tolkien?
I saw the films in the theaters either the week they came out or the week after. I had a friend of mine who camped out 5 days ahead of time in line to see Fellowship of the Ring, and he did it in a small, like, west of Portland, Oregon, almost farming community kind of place. Right, there wasn't a history of people camping out for, when Phantom Menace came out the year before or 2 years before, people lined up a few hours ahead of time, but he was there. Like, he made the paper. So I recall, I think, bringing him some Mountain Dew or something at one point, right? So I was like a high school kid when that was happening. But I saw those movies in the theaters when they came out, and I enjoyed them, but I didn't enjoy them as much then as I did more recently. When we were getting ready to do this, my wife and I went back and rewatched the trilogy and enjoyed them more. I think I understand why some people really get militant about them being like possibly the best films in the last 30 years, right? I saw somebody opine recently that you will not get, like, Hollywood's not capable of making a movie like that. Like, I don't even know I watched Ghostbusters Afterlife with my wife the other day. And after it was done, I was like, that movie was better than it had any right to be. Right? Like, and on the grand scheme of things, it wasn't even that great. I mean, I liked it, but.
Right. So similar for me. I liked it. I thought it could have been better. I would have liked kind of more originality and original direction, as opposed to, let's recycle some of the plot threads from the first one, bring the Chandler guy back and work it around that. And of course, Egon's ghost, as we will work, Harold Ramis back in. Sorry for the spoilers if you haven't seen that, but been out for months. Sorry.
Yeah. Go watch the Screen Rant pitch meeting for Ghostbusters Afterlife. It's so on the money, it should be illegal how on the money that one was.
Go watch any pitch meeting for that matter, because right. It's just always so on the money. Even if it's a film you like, you're still, he's right on that. But no, I totally agree as well, right? Because I feel like, when we look at Afterlife, like, a lot of us found a lot of enjoyment in it because there were certain nostalgic elements to it. And I think it does kind of lead us to kind of the age we're in movies in general, is that we live in a nostalgic age where it's all about saying, oh, these nostalgic elements are really nice and I'm really drawn to it. But when you actually look at the film, you actually look at the writing, you actually look at what is being presented, and you're right, it's really not that great of a movie. It's something that you're like, okay, I enjoy it, but yeah, it's not Lord of the Rings. And
congratulations. They didn't insult the audience. They didn't insult the fan base.
Right.
And there's that too. A thing I noticed was there wasn't any Lord's name in vain stuff, which made me happy.
Yeah. All read too. Nobody took the Lord's name in vain, which is amazing. But although, with that being said, there's a little bit of a parallel there. So we're lamenting the state of movies now, and just in general. But when Lord of the Rings came out, the whole fantasy genre was one that was just a little bit schlocky. In general, you just never had any kind of, because it's a tough medium to adopt. You either make it too medieval and too opaque and too hard to get into, or it just becomes too silly. Like Willow is one that comes to mind. It was enjoyable.
I was about to mention Willow. Yeah. There were two fantasy movies from my childhood that I absolutely love, but they don't age well. And one is Willow, and the other is Return to Oz. I'm one of those weirdos who actually like the post-apocalyptic Wizard of Oz sequel. Dorothy gets carted off to get electroshock therapy because she won't shut up about her delusion, right? Like, I liked that movie, but they didn't age well at all. And Lord of the Rings is what came out of nowhere because it was like Jackson, who I don't know how he did that. Because have you seen anything else he's done? Like his pre-Lord of the Rings stuff is weird, and I hated his King Kong movie. Absolutely hated his island of giant bugs eating people stuff. I was just like, no, I'm good. Although it was nice to see Jack Black trying to play a serious character in that film, but I hated that movie, and I haven't tried anything else he's done since then, including the Hobbit movies, because I was interested until people who I trusted told me no. Mm-hmm. They're like, you know how Phantom Menace is bad? This makes it look good. And at that point, I was like, oh, okay.
As hard as it is for me to give Peter Jackson a pass, on Hobbit, I'll give him like a little bit of leniency only because it was largely studio direction that was coming. It was largely just a big cash grab. It was originally supposed to be 2 films directed by Benicio del Toro, which I would actually be interested to see what that would look like, frankly.
Yeah, that would be a little trippy, probably.
You know, well, nothing could be worse than what they actually came up with. But then so then we end up with 3 movies that are about anything but The Hobbit.
Yeah,
I don't know. I was going to say you did the Book of Boba Fett, so I don't think you did, because I think if they let whoever episodes, and if they let Robert Rodriguez direct The Hobbit.
Oh, and the chase scene. I mean, it's just, and I think that the difference though between those two, especially, is that it seemed like for the Lord of the Rings movies, he actually did try, and again, this is where that constant debate will come up between people who are diehard fans of the book and people who are diehard fans of the film, and then there's those in-betweeners, right, who are like, I like them both. I feel like Lord of the Rings was very much hey, I want to adapt these stories, and I want them to be as close to the book as I possibly can, so respecting the source material as much as possible, but also for it to be a film, whereas, as you mentioned, the Hobbit films fell more so into this studio product almost, and he got so caught up in his own stuff where he tried to throw in all this extra stuff from the appendices, right? He tried to justify all the decisions he made by saying, oh, well, there's reference to this and there's a reference to that, but then the Hobbit itself just got lost. Like, there's just very little of the original story back. And then I think there's a correlation that can be made too with the fact that the original Lord of the Rings films, the reason why they hold up, one is that they were made to be adaptations, and I think that they are, as far as just like films are concerned, film adaptation, it's a good film adaptation. Whether or not it's a good adaptation of the book is, I think, one that's worthy of discussion, but it's a good film, right? All 3 are really good films. Whereas the 3 Hobbit films, those are CGI fest atrocities that are again, just pure cash grab and lack almost any, even just from a basic filmmaking standpoint, any sense of, like, not even just integrity, but even just film IQ, as it were. It's like, and I think it being one on film and one on digital, I think, is also kind of like that big change and big difference.
So the question I have about this is, does this movie meet the same scrutiny that in the movie Spaceballs Yogurt served? His whole sequence about the merchandising sequence, does that apply to the Hobbit movies? I know probably not as badly, but I remember there were a lot of Hobbit toys.
I think it does, and also because the other thing that kind of adds to it is, remember, man, you know what? To be honest, I think the reason why the Hobbit films were terrible are not necessarily just because of the studio. I blame James Cameron. I blame James Cameron, and I blame Avatar. And the reason why is because it was when Avatar came out that all of a sudden studios became obsessed with alternate formats, right? Everything got released in 3D. And then eventually you had Peter Jackson who says, oh, I can do that too. Let's do HFR. Let's do the high frame rate. Let's play around with this for the Hobbit films. And then he put them out at like the 48 frames per second. And I saw all 3 in theaters at 48 frames per second. One, because I'm a completionist in a certain way, but also because I think I mentioned this prior to the stream where, I had a strong connection with The Hobbit with my dad. So I saw all 3 films with my dad. And so I just had to do that for that reason. But for 48, so yeah, I think that it definitely fits that Spaceballs connection because he was just even the film itself was merchandise because it was like, hey, here's this new film technology that's never really been fully tested, but let's just see how it goes, and it'll cost you more at the box office, and we'll take your money.
Right. Wouldn't that higher frame rate give you a headache? That's a
It-
theory, isn't it?
Yeah, for some people it did. It made for me it looked so weird. It reminded me of anytime you go into a TV store and you see that it's on like soap opera mode. Like that's how it looked like. The only thing that was improved was CG. CG did look better because I saw it in both the HFR and then like the regular frame rate. It did make the CG look better, but it's not a worthy trade-off.
It's a little like when I go into Costco and see the 8K TVs, and they don't look
Yes.
sharper than a 4K TV, but they look off.
Yep. Not
Right.
natural.
No, certainly not. So with the films, they come in. It's certainly they're more faithful to the source material than I think most modern productions are to their material in general. And of course, I'm coming at it from not quite a book purist, but a book realist. I love the books. I generally prefer them to the movies, but I recognize you have to adapt for film. You can't. And I think we talked about this off screen. Like Tom Bombadil is one of the big things, and that was the big right from all the book purists, especially because I think other people have pointed it out on their streams. Just want to give credit. I think it was Nerdrotic that pointed this out. But it's one of those things. Anyone who knows Tolkien people know this, that this was like the hippies book, right? And that Lord of the Rings was a big hippie phenomenon in the 70s. So the movies come out and there's no Tom Bombadil, and they flip their lip. Which
was Tom Bombadil the hippie character?
He's a very complicated and enigmatic character in the book, and so the way it works in the book is that one of the things they did that makes a lot of sense in the movie is they truncate the Hobbit's journey, so that when Frodo decides he's going to leave, they cut out the way this happened in the book, where there's a 20-year time jump from Bilbo's disappearance to Gandalf coming to Frodo to test the ring to determine that it's actually the one ring. And then further, so what they decided to do is not to make too much noise about the departure. So instead, they just simply make it look like Frodo was selling Bag End and moving in this relations over across the Brandywine. And from there, they take a segue to the Old Forest. And the Old Forest is this bit of a place where the trees are known to move. There's some strange goings on there, and so the hobbits try to make their way through the Old Forest, and so they cut all this out in the movie, and it actually works very seamlessly in the movie the way they do this, and they make their way to they depart the Shire off the Buckleberry Ferry, and they get to Bree, which is about 2-3 days trip from there, and so they just make it look like it all happens really quick, and it helps the pacing of the film, and it's actually a very good decision on Jackson's part, but by doing that, you lose the entire occasion where Tom Bombadil shows up, because the hobbits are caught by this tree that has these horrible powers that has kind of ensnared them in a spell. And Tom Bombadil comes by, and he's this very enigmatic being. He's supposed to be the first one. And there's theories there. You can go on the Tolkien fan sites and channels and whatnot. There's so many theories about who Tom Bombadil really is. Was he like the incarnation of an idea? Of like an idea of virtue or something like that? Was he, really the first being, to incarnate in the world before maybe the Einar and the Maiar did in the Silmarillion? Nobody really knows. It's this big mystery that's left, right? Tolkien. But the ring has no power over him because he's completely beyond the powers that made him. But at the same time, he's unconcerned with it. So he comes and he helps the hobbits out of the trouble, gives them, food and shelter. Meanwhile, the ring wraiths are looking around endlessly. They can't find them because this detour helps them a good bit. And then on their way out again, they get caught again. Bombadil's got to come back and save them again. So anyway, so this whole journey is lost because of what I think is unfortunately a very necessary decision to truncate this particular journey to help the pacing of the film. Because I think you could correct me, the theatrical edition was 2.5 hours, and the extended was about 3.
No,
Am I right?
the theatrical were about 3, and the extendeds were about 4.
Yeah,
because when I watched them recently, I didn't do the extended simply because I can't fit that into having toddler.
And I was able to somehow fit it in just over like a length of time, because the one thing I like about the extent, so I showed this off earlier, so I got the 4K Steelbook edition set.
I just got the regular 4K.
Yeah, but I like that it comes with a theatrical and the extended cut, so that way you have both options there. But what I love about the extended is that even though it's a pain having 2 different discs, they have it where each disc is essentially a full movie. So I want to say the first disc is about 90 minutes, and then the second disc is about an hour and 40 minutes. So yeah, each of, like, for at least that was for the Fellowship. So the Fellowship, I want to say, ended up being like closer to like a little over like 3.5 to 4 hours. It gets longer. Every single one of them gets a little bit longer as it goes through it. But I like the way that they present that in the way that they've done the release on it, and it just looks fantastic also on the 4K release.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that. I don't know if I have an up-to-date TV for that, but I'll have to. I'm sure that I have two, and they're both very old. So
yeah, don't get a 4K player unless you get a 4K TV. So
right.
My wife and I got a 4K player because I saw they were putting Jaws out on 4K, and as old movies go, that's one of my favorites because it's about a bunch of dudes doing manly things and having a bunch of character development, and there's a shark sometimes. So
Robot
also make
shark.
sure you get a good TV as well.
Bruce the Shark.
I just saved up for like the LGC one, which is this like OLED, like just again one of those top of the line things, and just watching it, one of the first things I knew I had to watch was the Lord of the Rings, and it just, everything looks so great. And I think again this goes back to that discussion between Lord of the Rings films versus Hobbit films, is that basically the Hobbit's on 4K, and that's the reason why it's interesting. If y'all saw that special edition set they did, right, that had all of the films, it sold terribly to the point where they had to like cut it in half in price. Like they couldn't give it away because one, it didn't have any of the extra like special features that like have been on previous releases, but then also two, no one's going to actually want to buy any set that has the Hobbit on it because it's never going to look as good as Lord of the Rings, because anything shot on film when transferred to 4K is always going to look better than anything shot on digital. Like that's just a fact.
Like you see film reviews of you see like the home media reviews for like on YouTube channels, and they always say they always tell you that like Marvel movies don't look very good in 4K because they're almost all CGI.
And they're fake 4K, really. It's upscaled because they don't render the CGI at 4K. They render it at 2K because, again, think about it. If it takes a certain amount of time to render those images in 2K resolution, twice the time to do it in 4K resolution. Yep.
So I guess back to the films. I know I didn't actually mention anything about it because when I saw the films, I was in college when they came out. And I remember I'd read the books, I read The Hobbit, and I'd read The Fellowship, and I don't think I'd gotten through the other books yet. And I remembered seeing it, I was just blown away. One, fantasy was always something that was interesting in a fit with various medieval fascinations and whatnot. And here was something, it was so well done. And I'd even forgotten half the details from the book when I saw the movie. Which, on the one hand, it's like your phantasms, your imagination of what's in the book now gets corrupted by the movie. You're always going to remember the movie characters now. But in the other, it was really dramatic. The music is one of those things that, being a classical score, it was just amazing. It set the mood perfectly. The choice to film in New Zealand, everything just kind of fits squarely, and it was very uplifting at a time in my life that was very trying for me, actually. So as I was still an agnostic, I'd been an agnostic like quietly, and then because it was a very Catholic college, and so it wasn't a good spot to be in, and so but still dramatically very interested in theology, and so generally depressed. These movies came at a really important point, during that period, and it was like in the next year somebody was praying for me, and I got the faith back. I didn't deserve it, but
no, none of us did.
So somebody merited that for me because I deserved to keep going wherever I was going, my Nietzschean quest for Zarathustra or whatever.
Did you own a fedora and a trench coat?
I did not. Wish I did. Actually, I do have a cloak. I should have worn that today. I should have had a cloak with a nice long pipe, and except I can't smoke in here. But my building.
I went to Portland State University, right, and there were people who would hold court in the park blocks there who looked like the fedora atheist meme. Like they
Oh,
were like the
goodness.
embodiment of that.
Right.
So
Oh goodness. Back to the random thought about the Tom Bombadil character, because as I said, I'm much more of a movie than book. But my dad had read the books when we were younger. Tom Bombadil, is that the one where he turns into a bear, or he can turn into a bear?
No, that's Beorn. That's from The Hobbit.
That's from The Hobbit. Okay, all right.
Yeah, so Beorn turns into a bear, and
Okay.
whereas so Bombadil doesn't turn into anything, but so he's married to Goldberry, the River Daughter. And it's not clear if these are actual beings, if these are like Einar or Maiar, or some being that become incarnate or what have you. But anyway, so in the boundaries he's set for himself, there's nobody above him. So, but he's described with yellow boots. He's described, he basically sings songs all the time. So let me hold on a minute. There's this kind of segue, but it'll be worth it. So, because I don't know if you've ever seen too, there's various groups that do, songs that adapt songs from Lord of the Rings. So, all right, good. So let me share the screen here, and I'll put this on briefly, like a minute or so. There we are. Let's see.
Let's see if Ryan can handle technology.
Right, it's there we go.
better him than me.
All right. Of course, you know what? We're going to have an ad.
Of course.
It's just
Sure,
my luck. I should have already had that going when it went to share the screen. But
It's okay. My channel today got found by somebody who created a channel of their own that they named after mine and stole my Belloc image and then used it to post a bunch of WhatsApp links. I only found out because somebody emailed me. The one comment that YouTube didn't bother letting me know about. So I spent 45 minutes deleting comments after I banned the person.
My goodness.
It happens. It happens to people.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yep. That's.
I've seen that image before.
Yeah.
If they'd had him in the movie, who would have been a good actor to play him? I would have said the actor that had played Gimli, but
I could see him doing that.
yeah.
Oh, who could have been
I'd say Jack Black, but he'd ham it up a little too much.
No, the guy who played what's the actor's name? The actor who played Slughorn in the Harry Potter films. I don't know if y'all had seen the Harry Potter films.
I don't recall. I don't think so.
Okay.
Years ago, I had a girlfriend who had never seen Star Wars, and I'd never seen Harry Potter, so we agreed that we would show each other those movies. She snickered all the way through Star Wars. I wasn't that rude to her movies.
Yeah, I'd read the first Harry Potter, and then I'd warned my sister that this isn't really a book that we should be getting into. And then when the movies came out, I kind of skipped them. So. Yeah.
I don't know. I was the guy whose favorite character in Harry Potter was the lady in the pink dress. So, because I like over the top bad guys, and
There we go.
Also, I think Daniel Charbor won. He says Nicolas Cage should have been Tom Bombadil.
Nicolas Cage should be in everything.
He should be the next Doctor Who. Let's be honest.
That'd be an improvement of what they had. I don't even watch Doctor Who, but I saw clips, and that was enough for me.
So with the films, we could talk all. I could talk all day about book stuff, and there's only one or two points I really want to bring out, which we could do later. But in terms of, we know, the three of us know, that the books have a very Catholic theme to it. I don't want to say analogy because Tolkien hated the use of analogy. Mostly because analogy is when you put a double meaning in to apply to something political, something that's a burning issue now, and you want people to reflect on it that way. Star Trek VI being an analogy for the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, and so that's why an allegory, and so he hated that idea. Mostly because he knew people were trying to turn the ring into this allegory of the atomic bomb or something like that, which he explicitly disavowed.
Yeah.
So. But there is an analogy properly. There is an idea that's almost like a typology, really, of Christianity. Just as the stories themselves, Tolkien conceived them as a like a mythos for England. He looks how English natural writing and mythology kind of got, suppressed by the replacement of Anglo-Saxon by French during the Norman Conquest. And so he looks as, if such a thing could exist, a mythology for England, what would it be? And then he draws from the classical sources of the Anglo-Saxon language itself to largely work this narrative. But because the Anglo-Saxons were Catholic, there's a lot of Catholic typology, and he himself, was that breathes through the work. Mm-hmm. How much do you see that, that being incorporated into the films?
Well, I think just kind of adding on to that point, because in preparation for the stream, I was listening to the audiobook, because I do typically better with audiobooks of the Fellowship. And it's the newer ones done by Andy Serkis, who, by the way, has just this, he has a great voice. And so it's just great to listen to him. But I actually found that part in the book where in the second edition, he actually explicitly talks about it. He says, "But I cordially dislike allegory in all of its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of readers. I think that many confuse applicability and with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the purpose domination of the author." So the reason why he hates it is because he feels that authors will use it to try and dominate the reader into submission, whereas the other, right, whereas as far as being able to apply it to different things, that's something that we have the ability to have control over. The reader has the ability to, and he was very much for people being able to apply it to whatever it is that they felt like they could apply. And so I think as far as the movies are concerned, the one scene where I think the best scene to me that really showcases a lot of just Catholic themes. I use it every year when I teach Sacraments, because just a little about me. I also, I'm a full-time religion teacher at a Catholic high school. And one of the scenes I always show whenever I do the Sacrament of Reconciliation is I show the scene from the very beginning of Return of the King, where it's the story of Smeagol. It's a story of how he came to be, because it's such a great representation, even visually, of the effects of sin on the soul, right? Of how it corrupts so quickly and so easily, but then also how it devours, and you just see this physical transformation of even just the actor Andy Serkis. You see this physical transformation into Gollum, and like the impact of sin on the soul. And I've always loved that sequence because of just how well it showcases that. Now, whether or not Peter Jackson had that mindset when he was doing it, or whether or not that's something that has a similar correlation in the way it's read in the book, that sequence has always stuck out to me as being one of the best kind of ways in which we could apply, especially when it comes to the effects of sin on human nature.
Dr. Stine?
I think for me, the one thing that I noticed more than anything else was just Frodo's determination to carry the ring and not necessarily have anybody else help him when he did it. That it was his burden to carry the ring, and that between that and Samwise's loyalty to him, and even when he said that he can't carry the ring for him, he can't carry his burden, his cross for him, but he could help him by carrying him. I think those were very Catholic themes to me that stuck out. And it's one of the reasons why when people say that these are not Christian stories, I always am left a little confused because they're very Christian stories. Like it's almost like the world is trying to meme the Lord of the Rings into being just another atheist allegory, and Amazon's going to help them with it, unfortunately.
No doubt. There's other things too. Some of them are a little more incidental. The reference to 40 days at various points of hard journeying, which is a little bit of just kind of a light touch. It's not anything really more explicit. But then you have Galadriel, who in many ways is likened to the Blessed Virgin in certain ways. You have the lembas bread of the elves, which has a virtue that's not seen materially, but it's they narrate in Return to the King. I think one of the chapters where Frodo and Sam are making their way through Mordor, that without the lembas, they would have failed quite some time ago. And so that it's, it has this hidden virtue and power in general.
Yeah.
There's a few other ideas. There's a lot of sacramentology. There's things that are important, almost like a means of which a certain power or grace is communicated. Certain swords having a specific power or virtue because of who made it, poured a certain degree of power and virtue into it. The original forging of the rings, actually, in the Silmarillion, have a similar thing, in as much as Celebrimbor, when he learns the craft, putting a certain power into a thing.
I think the ghosts that Aragorn got that he in Return of the King, they were in a very purgatory kind of state. They couldn't be freed until they paid the last farthing, right, for their sins.
Right.
And who was the one who redeemed them? The king, right? I mean, there's a lot there just in that whole sequence too.
And I'm glad that you mentioned about the bread, because I think that was actually something that Peter Jackson definitely missed, because in the way it's presented in Return of the King, it's very much or maybe it's Two Towers, where basically it's like a mockery, where it's like, oh, what do we have? Oh, more Landis bread. But what's interesting is that it's only in the extended edition of the Fellowship where they make reference to the fact that a small amount will be enough to fill your belly. And then that's when they have the joke as well, because of course, I think it was, I always forget whether it was Merry or Pippin, had like an entire, like several loaves, right? Had more than enough. And so like, we're just like, oh, I had a lot more than just the small piece there. But no, I think that's something where it's interesting, because they reference it in the extended edition of the films, right, about the impact that has, very much a bread of life connection. But then they almost have this mockery of it in the film. I don't know if that line's in the book or not. Of what do we have? Oh, more Landis bread, like this. Whereas what you had said was that it was actually an admission of, if we did not have this, right, if we did not have this precious gift of this elvish bread, that there's no way we would have made it. And I think that also the extended edition Fellowship having that line in there helps later lines make so much more sense about, oh, I'm trying to ration so that we can make it on the way home. And I'm thinking to myself, how can they make it on the way home with what they have? But then when you recognize the power of the Lamb's bread, then it makes sense. So having that extra bit of information in the extended edition actually helps make things make a lot more sense. And
actually, something about the bread that I remember now also is who couldn't eat it. Gollum, the absolute epitome of corruption and sin, could not eat the bread, which is sort of an inversion of what happens because we can, if we're in a state of grace, if we're not in a state of grace, consume the Eucharist. Physically, we are capable of doing it. But what happens? It's just more sin is piled on top of us. So it's sort of an inversion of the same concept, but not a demonic conversion, obviously.
Yeah.
Right.
And speaking of demonic, it's a female Casey Royals fan makes a great point about Wormtongue, also being a great representation of a demonic presence. And I think in a lot of ways, I can almost see that character having a lot of correlations even to other works of even other works from other authors like C.S. Lewis, right? Screw Tape letters, right? I think there's a strong connection to be made even between that. And it's just interesting, right? Because it just shows that one can be so corrupted just by the demonic presence, the demonic influence, and that it takes Gandalf the White. It takes, again, basically a priest, right? Because that's what the wizards really represent, as like this priestly class. It takes the priest going through and having that power of essentially, being able to offer that sacrament of reconciliation and forgiveness to free, right, the bondage of sin and the bondage and effects of it. So yeah, there's so much, as you mentioned, sacramental imagery that we can look to.
Right. And someone actually brings up Gandalf and Saruman. Juliet Ramirez in the chat. I'll read it. Saruman was the highest of the wizards until he was corrupted by Sauron, and then Gandalf becomes the highest of the wizards, sort of like the fall of Lucifer and Saint Michael. And that is actually an interesting idea, because actually in mentioning wizards, of course, we come into one of the areas where critics of Tolkien as such, and the movie particularly, like to get into, is the use of magic. A wizard. Well, those things aren't Christian. Those aren't Catholics. So what's the wizard? What's the magic doing in here? I don't know if anyone wants to take that or.
Gandalf's wizardry never really looked like any other movie's portrayal or any other novels portrayal of, sorcery, of arcane magic. He just there was something fundamentally different about what he was doing than other depictions of wizards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because whereas typically in witchcraft you have very much the use of the elements, right? So I'm using this object to bring about this effect. It was more of just this almost like this internal power. So again, I think that really it can a lot of ways be attached to how we can really look and view the wizards as a priestly class, and how once a priest is ordained a priest, right, they are granted that ministry, they are granted that authority, right, they are granted that power to offer those sacraments. And that power, of course, does not come from them, but rather it comes from God, as they're a conduit of it. And I think that is represented very much in that way, even in the films too, right? Where it's just something that comes forth from it, where it's not. And that's why I was even looking up just the definition of fantasy. And fantasy in general typically deals with magical themes and magical elements. And so it's interesting that the magic used here is not typical of what you would see in maybe some other fantasy realms. And I think that knowing the background of Tolkien, it actually helps us better understand the different classes, and especially with the Hobbit, right, with having the understanding of the white wizards, right, you have the gray order, essentially, you have the blue order as well, right? There's all these different orders that exist. It's, again, holy orders, as it were. So there's a lot of connections that can be made.
There's another fact too. Some of it connects back into the book lore, into the Silmarillion, in the nature of because you have the one Iluvatar who creates the Arda, the world, and then he also creates. He has the angels that are around him. They're like angels, these higher spirits, these higher powers. There's two branches of them. There's the Einar, which later they're called the Valar. And then you have the Maiar, right? And so in each of they're angels essentially, and they take forms when they come in the world, right? And so in terms of the mythos of the whole thing, and then you have the elves, and when the elves are created, the firstborn, they have a certain degree of power, a connection with nature, especially the ones that go off to Valinor, with the Einar and the Maiar that have taken forms in Middle Earth. They learn they get great power from them. They learn a great number of things from them, and so their grace, it all increases. They have more of a power that comes from all this. So when even men, the power of men, from Numenor, for example, they have power because their forefather was Elrond's brother, Elros, and so they were half elven. They're the sons of Irindel, and they're given a choice. All right, you can be elves or you can be men. And they choose to be. Elros chooses to be a man, but he has the grace and power of elves, and his father Irindel that comes down with him, and so there's certain abilities that they have. And the wizards are all Maiar, right? So the power that they use is consonant with what they are, with their being, but it's not being done through another agency, through a darker agency. And there's even a line in the book about it. So that, because remember, the hobbits are the ones writing the book. Bilbo writes it, and Frodo writes the book, and then and Sam finishes it up. The hobbits really don't know a whole lot about these really great matters, so they see these things and they call it magic. And so in the actual book, I've got my nice edition here.
This little flex, he's flexing.
Anyway. So in the chapter, The Mirror of Galadriel, in the movie, they changed it to where it's just Frodo looking into the mirror. But unless I'm mistaken, I'm pretty sure that's right. And then in the book, it's Sam. Sam is there too with Frodo. And Galadriel offers, hey, do you want to look into the mirror? And, no, I don't want to see. And she turns to Sam. And you, she said, for this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I don't understand clearly what they mean. And they seem also to use the same word of this deceits of the enemy. But this, if you will, is the magic of Galadriel, etc. So they can't make a distinction, but she's confused by the term magic altogether. It doesn't really make sense to her why they would call it magic and also call Sauron's works magic, because what they do is a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm. Like Sauron's is much closer to the arcane things that is depicted in other fantasy stories, and you notice it's
right
linked to the devil. Sauron's the devil, obviously. So, it's why I always find it interesting when some Christians say you shouldn't read Lord of the Rings because there's magic. It's like, okay, I get the argument for Harry Potter. Besides the fact Harry Potter's not even that good anyway, but I get the argument for that with that. But come on.
Yeah, there's other things that could be said too. In fact, if you look at between the Silmarillion and even the Hobbit, there's a lot less magic in Lord of the Rings than in either of those, actually. Just all told.
Mm-hmm.
So I can understand people being on edge about things, and obviously, if the genre doesn't work for you and it's not something you like,
Yeah.
Too bad. But at least find something you like then. But it seems like, I get why people would be on edge, being cautious about things, especially with so much, wickedness in the culture right now. But in reality, it's not the same thing, so that even though they use the word magic, they're not doing magic. They're not teaching you spells. They're not encouraging you. Rather, these are beings that do these things because they are very much as an angel does something, very much as a priest at mass does something that I can't do.
Mm-hmm.
So at least that's how I've always seen it.
And we can't, fully explain, right? There's a great mystery. That's what we call it, like the mystery of faith. And it's interesting because I think that to some people, right, especially think about early church missionaries going off to distant lands. I bet a lot of the people that they were preaching to thought that they were doing some type of magic. I bet that for them, the concept of transubstantiation would be described in their own language, or they're in their own terms as some type of magic. And so I think that there can be even a correlation to be made there, that just because one doesn't understand something, and I think having that line in the book, especially where even the character says like you call it magic and I'm confused by this because I don't see it in that way, right? Just as we know and we see those that know and understand the sacraments, right? We don't view that as just like some magical spell, right? We view it rather for what it actually is, which of course is the deep mystery of our faith, which is why, of course, we could go off a whole tangent about the the greatness of the Usus Antiquior, where literally within the actual prayer of consecration, the words mystery of faith is spoken. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mysterium Fidei, right? Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, so within that, there's another thing, and I guess this is kind of the represents kind of like my biggest criticism, book to movie. If you'll tolerate the monologue for a minute, the biggest thing for me is that, so in the books, there's a certain analogy of grace that men have in general. So principally, in as much as, like we already mentioned, the men of Numenor descending from Elros, and they have this grace and this power. And then, of course, throughout the wars in the Second Age, and I do have to say the prologue of the films encapsulates all of these events perfectly. They give you exactly the amount of information you need to know the story. They don't go on in this long meandering introduction that you just don't need, the way the Hobbit it seems to, in my opinion. And so the movie Hobbit. So he gives you exactly what you need to get into the rest of the story that will then unfold in the films. Because it's so much larger in the books, where they actually did the Numenorians defeat Sauron, bring him back to Numenor, and he corrupts them there. The last king, Far Arizon, he's scared of dying. So they'd already turned on the elves, and now they start worshiping Melkor, the teacher of Sauron, the first Dark Lord. And so the Valar just destroy Numenor altogether. Only a small handful of the faithful escape. But they're still Numenorians, and they're still very powerful, and they found Gondor and Arnor. So when the War of the Last Alliance happens with Sauron, it happens very differently from the movie, because what happens is that during the fight, Sauron himself comes down to face off against the allied army, and Gil-galad and Elendil themselves, they fight Sauron and they kill him, and they die in the process of defeating him. So Isildur comes up to a Sauron who's been killed and cuts the ring from his hand. It cuts the finger right off and takes the ring from it. And that's how it takes place in the book. And that's actually important when you look at, the later, development of other characters. Aragorn, of course, he generally maintains a lot of the grace as a Numenorian in the film, except that they've changed his motivations. Instead of wanting to be king, now he doesn't want to be king. He's got to introduce that kind of democratic element. But then Faramir is one of the characters that I think gets the shortest shaft in the movie compared to the book, because Faramir also, whereas Boromir didn't seem to get any of the power of Numenor, Faramir did. So that when Frodo is in his power, he refuses to take the ring or have anything to do with it. Not because he was so much better than Boromir, but he did have that particular grace, that analogy of grace, seeming to continue to work. And that, not all men are worthless and weak and completely pathetic. Sauron is afraid of Aragorn because he knows if Aragorn gets the ring, Aragorn really could challenge him with it and use the ring and the power that's within it to overthrow him, because he really does have that power. So, and there's a few other things we could add in there too. But now let's look at the movie version. So the movie version, of course, that as it folds out, the War of the Last Alliance, Elendil is killed. And then Isildur, reacting as Sauron comes to pick him up and presumably strangle him or do some other thing, cuts the ring off there. And that mere accident of cutting off the ring is what just separates Sauron from the ring in his bodily form. Right. And so they defeat him that way, but he keeps it because men are weak. And then he continues, and then you have like they said Faramir no longer is depicted in the film. He's going to take Frodo into to Minas Tirith. Other elements. It focuses on the weakness of men rather than on the potential for grace and power in men. And that's kind of how I see that distinction difference. But I don't know. Are there any other Christian elements that you guys see in the book that before we move on?
In the book or in the movie or in
the movie? Sorry.
I'm trying to think. Well, one that just came to mind is because I actually someone had been mentioning it in the chat, and I thought it was a pretty interesting and good way. Delane B was saying that it seemed that Gandalf, every time he was about to do something, it was almost like he was praying before doing anything, and that the elves as well, right? That it was almost as if they were praying before they did anything that would be conceived as magic. And so there's that strong element there. But then it reminded me, right, of that moment where Arwen, and again, I don't know necessarily if this happens in the book this way, where Arwen, right, says those words, right? If you want him, come and claim him. And what happens, right? These demonic beings are coming across, right? These corrupted men are coming across. And what happens? A giant flood of water washes them away. So even in that one moment, you can have a connection made, one with, of course, the flood, right? Just the washing away of evil from that area. But then also in a certain way, there's that connection always with water, with baptism as well. Not to say that, of course, it doesn't change them in any way, but it does free. It's really that last act that frees Frodo from being able to be saved, and still having the scar. That's why I also love too, is that the scar always will remain with him, because even though we are cleansed of the stain of original sin, we are still living in a world where we're impacted by sin, and so it always is something that will impact us because of that.
Yeah, the scars of sin remain.
Exactly.
And as you'll recall at the end of that movie, not only were men weak, but so were hobbits. Frodo tried to keep it too.
Yes. No, that's true.
And it was Gollum, and Gollum's corruption led to his own destruction, and oddly also to the liberation of the world from Sauron.
Right.
Weirdly.
Yeah, indeed. There was a point I was going to make. Oh, well, actually, it didn't happen that way in the book, but that was actually a good change as far as Arwen, because it was actually a different character. But the way they brought Arwen in, it actually was, in terms of the adaptation of the film, it didn't really hurt anything. And it still kept very much what was taking place in the book. Even though the character they had in the book was far more powerful. But, so be it. Because some things, you're going to have to change here and there. And So it wasn't the end of the world for me in terms of changes. But
have you ever seen any film adaptation that was 100% faithful to the book?
yeah,
I can't think of one.
say that I have. No, I've
Even
certainly
even miniseries, which can get closer because there's so much more time to
Right.
work with. Even they have to leave some things out.
Right, or even like The Expanse, which was
I was-
adapted by the very
I was just
authors
thinking
of
that.
the books.
Mhm.
Even there, they changed things. They combine characters. Like you have Drummer, who's like 3 or 4 different characters in the book. You have Michio Pa, who's a completely different person, and then this other person that's, and they just you have characters like that um, they kill people in different ways from the book because it seemed to work better on the
Mhm.
screen. And so, and that's why I said, even though I'm a bit of a book purist to a certain extent, you have to adapt it, and there's things you're just not going to be able to get in.
Yeah.
So the scarring, the Tom Bombadil being like, with that one famous one that everyone's torqued off about, but other changes too, like the changing of the time jump between Bilbo and Frodo, and but sometimes these things have other consequences you have to deal with in different ways. So one of the things you see in Return of the King in the book is that the sine qua non for the defeat of the Witch King was Merry, stabbing him with this sword that was a sword of Westerness. It was a sword that was specifically made for the Witch King's downfall and the old kingdom of Westerness, that is Arnor, which is the northern kingdom of Gondor. And and that's even narrated in the book. The smithy who had made it long ago would be pleased to know how it cleaved his undead flesh and everything. And in the film, you don't have that, of course.
It would have been nice if they'd
cut
included
that all out.
It turns out
Right.
it without that, it makes the scene look like some sort of nod to feminism, which is really annoying.
Yeah.
And that's one of the, now there could have been another way to include that. Although there's so many things, but because again we're truncated, we're getting rid of the old forest, and therefore we're getting rid of the Barrow Downs, and we're getting rid of, so they never find the occasion where they get that sword. And that's so that becomes one of those problems you could solve a little later, but they decided not to go there. So
it's interesting too how like I'm thinking of even more like how much water is used in so many great ways in the film, and again I would assume also in the book. But when the Ents free the river, right, and the river washes away everything that was built by Saruman, right, everything that was built, right, his machine of war is completely wiped away, right? So I think that's another connection to be made to Noah and the flood, of just again those waters being held back, the waters of grace, right, the waters that could purify, just being finally let go to wash away all of the filth that had been built up by Saruman. I think there's another connection there. And people in the chat are talking about another great one. So I'd use the connection of Saruman's hold over King Theoden as being reconciliation, but I think that actually hers is a lot better. Juliet's is a lot better because she points out that it's actually a lot more akin to an exorcism, and I think that is totally spot on and much of a better comparison.
Right. Manage this right there. Perfect. Okay. Fantasy in general. Is fantasy something that Catholics should be able to indulge in? Is there some people that are of the opinion, well, it's just a waste of time, you should just read saints stuff and pray and be holy and never indulge? But it seems like human interests are varied, and there's different ways, different categories that of thought and interest that people have that can be wholesome and that can still be good. But it seems like fantasy is something that properly you can dip into for a time, kind of almost like a vacation, like escapism in a healthy sense of it, and you take something of it and then you step back. What do you guys think about that?
I think that's accurate. I mean, I have a general rule about consuming popular culture things, and it's do it with discernment. I can't say no to any genre of music at all, any genre of film. Really, there's always something out there that is art, Like art has a purpose, and it can be consumed, I think, with discernment. Like the Lord of the Rings is a fine example of fantasy that's safe to consume. Would I suggest somebody go and watch Game of Thrones? No. They're not the same thing. And they're, that might be an extreme example. So how about that Wheel of Time series? I heard that one was so well received by people that didn't they cancel that already, by the way?
I'm not sure, actually.
Yeah, I forgot whether it got renewed for a second season or not, but yeah, a lot of people like a lot of for anyone who either Ryan watches Friday Night Tights every now and then, but the big joke with Az, right, of 38 seconds is because it all stemmed from him only getting 38 seconds into the show before he was like, okay, I'm done. Like he was just like, I'm okay, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. So I know a lot of people who have gone into the show and have just not been able to fall into it. But yeah, I agree as well. Discernment is a big part of it, and I even bring this up with my students because they always, they'll ask me saying, "Is it wrong for me to watch this show? Is it wrong for me to watch this?" And one thing interesting that comes up is Harry Potter. And like the mindset that I always bring up is it's like, well, it depends on what you're going into it with, right? So like, are you going into it with a proper understanding that it's a world, it's the world of fiction, and that you're reading it for entertainment, right? For leisure, because like again, leisure is a positive element. Or are you reading it for some other purpose? And then I bring up an opposite end where I say, now let's say you're wanting to watch on Netflix the Sabrina reboot, where they actually use actual legitimate demonic what's the word I'm looking for? They actually do they actually use elements for an actual seance, and they actually use pentagrams, and they actually use
elements of actual Satanism in the show.
These elements of actual satanic groups. It's like, notice how that is very different than just reading a book about a wizarding school, right? There's a huge difference between those two. So I think that process of discernment, as Anthony said, very important. I think with anything, not even just with fantasy. I think with any genre or anything worth, anything that will consume. I think we should always discern whether or not, one, the impact it will have or perceived impact it'll have on us, and also, are we taking care of the first principles as first things that we need to take care of?
And there's also another thing that goes into that too, though, and that is attachment. Are you too attached to it? I used to be the biggest Star Wars guy you'd ever meet. I had stupid amounts of novels and all that junk, and Disney cured me of that. They cured me of that when I was starting to wrestle with this, from a faith perspective, going, I got too much into this junk because it's kind of stupid. And then Disney put out their sequels, between The Last Jedi and Solo. I was done. I was done after that point. You can, watch some of the newer shows a little bit, and they're not even that good either. But you cannot get too attached to things. If you find yourself getting so attached that that's all you want to spend your time doing, and you spend more time on that stuff than you do on prayer, or you're at least not giving an adequate amount of prayer time in your life, then you should step back and put the fantasy away, put the music away, whatever it is, whatever your thing is, put it away, because there are things that come before those things. Like your real life commitments, your faith should come before watching Star Wars or watching Lord of the Rings or anything else, no matter how good or neutral morally what you're watching is.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we all have families. We all have children. Although I'm a little older, so I have older children. I have a 14-year-old son, and that's responsible enough to babysit. So it frees me up for a little more than either of you might be free to do. But even then, it's like you can always tell when something's catching on, when it's harder to do your prayers because you'd rather be doing this other thing. Mm-hmm. It's harder to it's like, oh, I read this book and I read so many pages of this book. How much scripture have you read? Or the church fathers? Or, how much have you taken time to do a visit to the Blessed Sacrament? Have you? And that's where the pitfalls, and just like you said, Anthony, the pitfalls for anything, really, no matter what it is. Sci-fi, that can, discovering Star Trek on Hulu was, potentially really bad for me, as I used to be a huge Trekkie. New Trek has destroyed a lot of things. So basically, for me, Star Trek is reruns. But it's still nice to go. Sometimes some of these episodes I haven't seen since the 90s. Sometimes, And so, but I have to limit it. It's like, well, when I'm doing mundane tasks or I'm packing up books and shipping books or something like that, that's when I'll watch a few episodes. And then when that's done, oh, it goes off.
I haven't seen a Star Wars movie since I watched Solo when it hit DVD when I rented it.
I'm sorry.
I used to watch those. I used to watch all 6 of the films about once a year with friends.
Right.
And then after Solo and after The Last Jedi, I was like, well, these are gonna go sit in my movie rack, and I haven't touched them since. So
yeah, the one thing that's kept me passionate about the originals is projects like Harmy's Despecialized Edition and these projects. It's Project 4K 77, Project 4K 80, Project 4K 83, where it's fans who are collecting film reels and doing 4K transfers on their own dime, on their own budget, and are actually doing the process of restoration that you're not going to see from Disney, and you're not even going to see from George Lucas. You know, George Lucas notoriously just like destroyed his film with the special edition releases where he changed a bunch of things. And so that is where I've actually found more enjoyment with it, because it's like you're watching the films as they were originally meant to be seen in higher definition. And I think that that's fun. And it's fun to dive into like the lore, and it's also Harmy's Specialized is especially crazy because he's taken all these different sources, which include some foreign language films, some in fact there was an original copy of the film that was put on one of the DVDs, like one of the special edition DVDs, where it was like a small file, like it was just like put in a corner, like a second thought. And so they've taken that and rotoscoped everything. It's insane. Like if you ever are interested in any type of film preservation or any type of just, you know, if you're just a fan of film in general, just look up Harmy's Despecialized on YouTube. There's a whole video where he breaks down his process, and it's amazing to see what he does to get the images.
All around, and I think that a lot of conservatives, especially a lot of Catholics, have kind of, especially I should say a lot of traditional Catholics, have a lot of whom watch this channel, have stepped away from film for the most part, and we're only going to watch movies from the 50s. Although when you get into it, there were a lot of bad films then too.
Yeah, don't get me started.
No idea. Yeah, that's probably another topic for another time, but. So I think a lot of people really aren't aware of how bad the current film situation is. Like we mentioned earlier, that Lord of the Rings, we're lucky that we got those films as good as they are, because now they don't have the capacity or the humility to make films even as good as those. Were all my criticisms for book adaptation or whatever, they're still better than anything we would get today if somebody set out to remake the trilogy. So I don't know, either of you guys. I guess Odin, if you want to talk about so I don't know how many people in this channel maybe watch certain other pop culture channels. I know we're all fans of The Critical Drinker, and he does a fantastic job of breaking down a lot of these currents. Although, for a lot of Catholics, he's not Catholic, and so he uses certain language that we wouldn't necessarily approve of.
And he makes some sexual jokes that some people would have a hard time with. But
it certainly was. So if you do want to check him out, I just got to give that warning. There's going to be a lot of stuff that you might not like on that scale. But just remember, he's not Catholic. Pray for him. But he's not meaning to offend you. But he does do a good job breaking that down. So, but anyway, so in the meantime, what are some of the things that we've seen in film today? And I'll just use this to segue into kind of where we're going with where Tolkien's going to be going.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as the films of today are concerned, and where I think that what you found is really, in an interesting way, you found a stripping away. You found the secularization of film, and I think a great example of that, because everything nowadays is a remake or reboot or based on previous material. There's very rarely original content out there. It exists, but it's not as common. And one great example I would say is going back to the film A Wrinkle in Time, directed by Ava DuVernay, one of the best directors ever. So given $100 million, and what does she do? She strips God out of A Wrinkle in Time, and it leaves us with an empty, hollow shell of a film that is atrocious. And I think that that film is actually a great example. If there's one positive element I could say to that film, it's a great example of what happens when you take God out of the story. When you strip God away, when you strip any sense of faith or any sense of morality or any sense of the sacred out of film and pop culture, that is what you're left with. You're left with these empty, hollow stories that either are just, in that case, it was a kid's film, and so it was just this empty, hollow film, or you go into the one of the two extremes, right? You have these you have the age of hyperviolence, right? So films that have no story, but they have a lot of great violence in them. And even I've fallen into that trap of enjoying those films, right? So one of my favorite films from last year was the film Nobody. And one of the things that's a part of it, though, is that it's derivative of other material, but it's got a lot of really cool fight sequences in it, right? So I'm drawn to that violent aspect of it. Or they go to the hypersexualized. And that's, I think, the biggest issue in modern day culture is the hypersexualization in our films, in our TVs, in our TV shows. And I think that is what we're really seeing being pushed. And you look to something like Lord of the Rings, and even though there's violence in it, the violence in Lord of the Rings, it's just nothing in comparison to what you see in a lot of stuff these days. And so that's why you look to even something where there are battles and people fighting, and yet it's done in such a way where there's still, I don't know, it's something that I feel has been lost in the realm of filmmaking. And it's sad to see it lost, because there are just so many great films that I don't think we'll be able to get ever new films that fit the same criteria or live up to those other films.
Anthony?
I have seen so very few new films in the last 3 years that it's almost laughable how few new films I've seen. I mentioned Ghostbusters Afterlife, which is probably the most wholesome of the 3 Ghostbusters movies. But yeah, I mean, modern film is plagued with everything is political. Every single movie that comes out now has some sort of message to it. And I think that's why most films are bombing at the box office right now, is that people used to have this thing called escapism, where they could escape from the talking heads on TV. And you can't go anywhere anymore in the culture and escape. At my gym is that there are TVs with the news on. And I'm there at like 3 a.m, and then there's local news talking about Trump still on the TV. And I think that's an indication for why films are failing right now. The ones that are doing really well seem to be dodging that bullet. You know, apparently the new Spider-Man movie is better than anything Marvel's put out in the last few years. Why? Because it doesn't have the message in it, right? It's just a film. It's just, guy in spandex fighting supervillains, which is what people pay to see those movies for. They're not paying for fine art, and they're not paying for the message. And I think that's at the heart of what we're dealing with now.
And with that one, I would also add nostalgia too, right? And I think that is giving fans what they want. And what a novel concept, right? If you give fans what they want,
Who would have thought?
They give you money. Who would have thought?
Capitalism 101.
Right.
But the people who are doing this are not people who are capitalists. And I'd say that as someone who has traditional Catholic attitudes about, that economic system. But, the people in charge of these things now often do things that make it look like they don't actually want to make money, that they don't care, that they work for these mega billion-dollar corporations. So they think that they can just, pump out box office bomb after box office bomb with no consequences. I don't think they were thinking realistically.
I don't think so either. And there's and you see so many reboots. That's the other thing, and which is just a sign of how Hollywood is out of ideas. It's tired. Its creative apparatus is more or less fallen apart. And like you see that in ancient Greek drama, actually, to a point where, it gets to the point where every single play is now some other version of Agamemnon and Troy. And then a new version of Sophocles' old version, and it seems to be going just to get this endless spiral, because to more glorify the state, which is to glorify Athenian democracy. So it has lost the gas, essentially, right about the time of the Peloponnesian War is on, and everything takes on this new heightened patriotic fervor as they fight the Spartans. And then the plays keep going, which more shameless, why we're the best type of thing. And so, culturally speaking, and I noticed with it's so many reboots of everything, it's all the same, and it's all the same thing that they're trying to push right now. And so now we move on to where Amazon purchased the rights to make a show from the Tolkien estate. The Tolkien estate put some very stringent controls on this because Christopher Tolkien insisted on it. And God rest his soul, he died last year. The late great Christopher Tolkien. And so now, more or less, the fetters are up. The current Tolkien estate, we got the money. And so it's kind of it's unleashed. And so a lot of people are celebrating today. I was going to pull up an article. I didn't see a good one to pull up really easily, but we were talking about this off camera. How so they just released, the showrunners just said, to address internet criticism. Of course, all the white supremacists on Twitter, right, that are all mad that they're going to wreck Tolkien's story. They said, no, it's not going to be a Game of Thrones. It's not going to have violent sexual content. It's not going to have, which, please God, that's true. It's. I
mean, didn't they actively cast for actors who would do
nude
nude
casting
scenes?
Call for nude scenes, and I remember that several months back. Maybe somebody from above killed that because of internet criticism, but we've also seen this before, though. If anyone. So I grew up in the 80s, and He-Man was the cartoon, and I remember as a kid, 1984, it was like
that was my jam when I was a kid.
Yeah, we're watching He-Man and things of this sort, and it was it's just what you loved as a kid. And now I was showing my son, and he's laughing. Of course, he's 14 now. He wasn't like a little 5-year-old like I was watching it. But I said, hey, you want to see how hokey the cartoons were when we were kids, right? So then they announced they're going to do this He-Man reboot, and they do the trailer, which is all from the first episode, and all the pretty much every decent scene in the first episode mashed together for a trailer. And it's like, that looks like it could be pretty good. It's almost too good to be true. And they even declared, Kevin Smith, the showrunner, even declared, oh, we're not going to make it woke. We're not going to kill He-Man off. We're not going to make Teela the main character. And that's exactly what they did. Every last thing. And so, I mean, great as mundane kids cartoon. But and I'm looking at that and I'm saying, what are they going to do with Lord of the Rings? Because they're telling us one thing just to kind of calm the criticism down before it gets out. But are they still going to make this a big? I mean, I could care less about race as such, but if you're going to make a movie about Kankan Musa, the wealthiest man of the world in the history of the world, the king of Ghana, right, in sub-Saharan Africa during the Middle Ages, wealthiest, most powerful man in the world, I would love to see a film on him. But what would happen if you cast a white man to play his role?
Well, that's sort of the meme that people make about these things, right? Where
there would be bloody murder.
Ryan Gosling as MLK, yeah,
exactly. But now you have Tolkien, who's writing this is a myth for England. This is a mythos of Anglo-Saxon and Norse culture and thought. Who were those people? They were white. It's nothing against any other race or whatever, but you didn't have like a hobbits with black and Hispanic and Iranian and pink-haired and purple-haired hobbits running around. But that seems like what we're going to get.
It has the potential to be in the running for the worst visual mistake made between that and the colorful biker gang in the Book of Boba Fett.
The Power Ranger gang.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the Book of Boba Fett.
Has it been confirmed that there's going to be hobbits in the Rings
and
of
that's
Power?
The other thing.
That would be weird, wouldn't it be? Because
the Rings of Power Second Age, they weren't there. Yeah. Right? The hobbits, their origins don't even begin until the Third Age, which they're never laid out very clearly.
There shouldn't be hobbits in that. But then again, This is a show in the First Age, right?
Well, they're not clear on that. The events that they're describing should be the Second Age. It should be after the downfall of Morgoth
And it's
and
called the Ring of Power.
forging
So
the Rings of Power, because that happens in the Second Age. Because all right, I'll make it quick. Another Silmarillion nerd moment here, but the long and the short of it is that they defeat Morgoth, who's the first Dark Lord. The Valar come and they rip him right out of his strongholds, and they lock him up beyond the world itself. Sauron was supposed to go back to Valinor for judgment, but he hides. He hides away and is missed. So the elves kind of now resettle. Numenor is doing its thing. They're still friendly with the elves at this period, and then Sauron appears, but under his fair form. And he had many forms he could take in the Silmarillion. Sometimes as a giant werewolf, sometimes as a hideous, horrible creature. Other times as this fair and beautiful creature. So he shows up as Anatar, the giver of gifts. And he goes to the elves in Lindon, but they don't trust him. Something just seems off, like Elrond and whatnot. They just don't buy into it. So he goes to Celebrimbor. Now, you could do fantastic film about Celebrimbor, because it's just an amazing character arc altogether. But so he listens to the Anatar, that is Sauron, under another guise, and he forges the rings, and he learns the ring lore from Sauron, and he crafts the rings, and that's how that goes about. And then Sauron, now that he's taught him the ring lore, now he shows himself to be the true master of it, because he ties and binds each and every single ring to his one ring. And that becomes the ring of power, right? The one ring. So then this starts the war. He goes to Celebrimbor demanding the rings, and he's sent them away, because they were aware of him, because the elves Galadriel and Gil-galad and Celebrimbor, when they were wearing the ring, they were aware of Sauron and that what he had done. So they send the rings away, and Sauron comes demanding the rings, and Celebrimbor says no, so he kills Celebrimbor and turns his body into a battle standard. And then he starts attacking, the other elves. He almost is successful, except the Numenorians, when they were still friends of the elves, they come across the sea and they defeat Sauron. So those are the events in the Second Age culminates with the fall of Numenor. So the Numenorians get mad because the gift of men is that they're supposed to die. Which they're not really seeing as a gift. The elves live forever. Why can't we live forever? Come on. And so they start to envy the elves, and then they're sundered from them. And so the king's men are the ones who appear, and they have this hatred of the elves. They use their own language. They no longer use Sindarin, the elven language, and that's how the breach is established. You have Tol Brandir. He tries to restore the friendship with the elves, but there's too many of the Kingsmen around. He's the guy who creates the Palantir, the Palantiri, seeing stones, right? But so his daughter then is supposed to rule and try to keep the fortunes of the faithful, as they're called, that is the elf friends, in power. But then Far Arazan is one of the Kingsmen. He usurps the throne, marries her, and that's when everything takes place, where they go and they fight Sauron. They bring him back to Numenor, and then he corrupts them, so they decide that they can get immortality if they'll just go to Valinor itself and step on the Undying Lands and take immortality from the Valar. And that's when the waves then come and they destroy Numenor altogether. So the Third Age begins with the destruction of Numenor. So these are all the events that the Amazon Prime show is allegedly, it's like 1700 years that they're going to put together. So the elves, it's not so much of a challenge because they're going to be the same, except in terms of maybe character development. But for men, you've got a whole lot of different people here. You're going to have a whole lot of time jumps. Putting all this together, even for a very competent director who means to do this justice to the source material, is very, very complicated.
Right. It sounds like what they're going to do. The only way I can see them doing it would be how like Prime is handling that Jack Reacher show. They're doing a season of novel. And so they'll be recasting the whole show except for like probably one or two people every season. And that's what Amazon will have to do. And I kind of wonder if that's going to make the show stupidly extra expensive to make, more so than the $400 million they're already spending on it.
Right.
That's a heck of a gamble, by the way. Think about it. If that show bombs as badly as a lot of us think it's going to, Amazon is going to have like mud on its face. They're going to take the crown from Kathleen Kennedy for the biggest squandering of the goose that laid the golden egg.
Right.
But that's what's so difficult too when it comes to Amazon and really streaming platforms in general is it's so hard to really gauge success because we can look at view counts and we can look at audiences, but it's hard to really say how many people have been added to the platform or have kept the platform because of X show. And that's what always makes the whether or not a film or a show is profitable or not so difficult to manage.
It's weird that you bring that up because it wasn't long ago that I found out that Star Trek, the original Star Trek show, was canceled by mistake because they thought it was bombing, that nobody was watching it, because this was before the Nielsen ratings happened.
Right.
And if they'd had the Nielsen ratings, they would have realized they had a top 3 show in the country at the time. And Star Trek would have gone 8 seasons probably instead of the 3 seasons that they got plus the animated series. But and that brings me to this. Amazon will know how popular the show is. So it's actually even worse because they'll know, and they can choose for political reasons to keep some garbage like that going as long as they don't lose too much money. Nielsen ratings are nice because they give you some transparency in highly politicized ages like this, where you can't even turn the television on and watch, a sitcom without being preached to. And it'd be nice to have that again.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me a bit of because you mentioned it, not even that they can hide behind the numbers that only they have access to, but that even the ones that we do have access to because of Nielsen ratings, right? I bring up one of my brothers from Friday Night Tights again, but poor Az watching the Batwoman series. It's like we know how poor that's doing, and yet they're like, we're gonna put another season. We don't care.
Right. Now that's the thing too. You know what? It's actually, I think it was Dave Cullen out of Ireland who called this in terms of the Batwoman series when they got renewed for a 3rd season. He said, at this point, ladies and gentlemen, they are trolling us. It's marvelous Irish accent. I wish I could do it justice, but he's right. They are trolling it. They know we hate it, but somehow they have the money and they're motivated enough to keep making it, even though nobody is watching it hardly, except poor people like Az struggling through it so they can rant about it. And I think of some other things like that, and I think too that other series that haven't done so well or may not be doing so well, like a lot of these Marvel series. I mean, just after
do better, Senator
Loki.
I haven't even seen it. I just know that scene from that show.
Yeah. I watched a couple. I'll pick it up on YouTube. I'll pay $2 to watch an episode or two, try to decide, because I refuse to get Disney Plus. And so if it's really going to be good and I'm really going to get into it, I'll buy the thing that way, even though I know Disney's still getting the money, but I just don't want to, log into it. So I watched like a couple episodes. It's like, what is going on here? It's like, no, I'm done. I'll wait for the reviews. And then there were a couple of the one I ended up watching was the Scarlet Witch and the WandaVision one, because it started off really intriguing and the premise was really good. So I ended up buying the whole thing, and then it just got progressively worse after I think of the 4th episode maybe.
And then it turned into her being the, enslaving an entire town and having a temper tantrum, basically.
Like, what is this?
But it's all fine. It's all good. No big deal.
And I haven't even seen it. I just know what it's about.
So, bottom line, do you think it's? Would you welcome? Somebody try. I don't know if the way it works with if you can do the right fan fiction with Tolkien characters, you have to get permission from the estate. I think you have to get permission from the estate. But Tolkien seemed, especially in Lost Tales, he seemed to expect that. I mean, he was mostly expecting his son, who did, continue writing things based on his legendarium. But it seemed like he, hoped that somebody else similarly minded in the lore and in the language would be able to craft further stories. Because you look at like with the Silmarillion, for instance, and you read that through, and it's not, doesn't read like Lord of the Rings. It's going to be a much more difficult book for you to read. But if you're used to Norse sagas, though, it'll fit in with a lot of Norse sagas, and it will be a similar type of style. But then you get to, I think it was Christopher Tolkien who devised this, or maybe it was J.R.R. Tolkien himself. The end, the Silmarillion, they have, you're out of the Silmarillion, really. You get through the 2nd age, and then they do the 3rd age, and they do the War of the Ring. And it's done in the exact same style as the rest of the Silmarillion. It's done in a couple of pages. Everything that is in here is just in about 5 or 6 pages at the end of the Silmarillion. And so you know how much is in that's just narrated in these few pages. And it reads just like everything else in the book. So there's endless amounts of stories that could be elaborated on, that could be drawn out, that could be worked into the lore, that could do you think that's something that I don't know, people would even have an appetite for? I know I do, but
It depends how they're executed.
Mm-hmm.
If you said 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I guess, after The Force Awakens came out, hey, does the public have this appetite for all these Star Wars spin-off shows that they're talking about doing, Star Wars spin-off movies? People would have said yes. A few years later, where the very best thing we got out of all that stuff was a couple of Mandalorian episodes hammered into the Book of Boba Fett. You see that it really is a limit to what you can do if you don't execute things well. And I don't think Hollywood is capable of executing anything well right now. Everything is propaganda. Everything's anti-family, anti-Catholic propaganda for the most part, to some degree or another. And I don't trust them to make anything good. This is why I cannot wait to see, Gary just melt down over the Amazon Prime show. I can't wait for that, because I know that Lord of the Rings is kind of a special thing. I believe he's someone who has said, but Lord of the Rings is special to him.
Mm-hmm.
And, the same with all the rest of those guys. I just can't wait for that, because there's no way that they're going to come out and say this was better than I thought it would be, unless their expectations were that it was going to basically just be pure cancer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unless it somehow knocks it out of the park, which again could theoretically, right? Anything's possible. The probability might be low. If they knock it out of the park, maybe you do see that, but it's gonna take a lot. But it would be interesting to me, because you had mentioned about other people taking things on, and obviously Amazon with having the rights in this specific instance to these ideas and concepts. I would love to see, obviously, we just got teased earlier. He's so great at teasing, but Master of the Ages Part 2, it's coming soon. Okay, how soon? I need to know.
Right.
But if that as a production company is able to really get off the ground, I think it'd be awesome to start to see some independent Catholic production companies be able to get some ground level support to be able to, because again, it's all downstream, these films and shows, right? These are how we are able to move the culture. And so could you imagine if you had a actually traditionally Catholic production company putting out like book accurate, faithful adaptations of these different stories, and then fans of those works like that could be what a goldmine for that company, but then also could allow that company to start to do other things in the realm of things like Mass of the Ages, where you're also preaching, right? You're also evangelizing as well, right? And I think that could be a really cool tool to see happen. So we'll see if they're able to do that. That's throwing ideas their way, but it'd be really awesome. I mean,
there have been Chesterton stories that I'd love to see brought to the big screen if done right. Like I'd love to see The Man Who Was Tuesday brought to the big screen. It could have been pulled off in the 90s. The 90s was probably the last decade somebody could have done it properly. Not anymore. Right. And I mean, you can just go down.
Didn't they do a Father Brown a couple years ago that was basically woke Father Brown?
So he was a Jesuit.
Well, I think he was actually, but
well, he was a Jesuit back when that was not a bad thing,
right? In the stories there was an interestingly there was a BBC adaptation of Father Brown in the 80s, and I don't mean the Alec Guinness one. That was, I think, it was 60s. Although that was the story, that Chesterton story when Alec Guinness was Father Brown. That was they brought the event that caused Alec Guinness to become Catholic. That is the original Obi-Wan, if anyone in the chat's not familiar. And so he was walking in this French town where they were filming, and he was still wearing his clerics, and this little boy said, "Oh, Father," and it was so kind and trusted him, and it made an impression on him, and it just had this positive kind of thought. The whole movie gave him a positive impression of Catholicism. Then when his son was dying, he promised God that if he'd heal his son, he'd become a Catholic. His son was healed. Guinness became a Catholic.
I didn't know Guinness his conversion story, but I knew he was a Catholic.
Right, and it was because of playing Father Brown.
Hmm.
So, but there was a BBC adaptation of Father Brown that was actually fairly good. I think it was in the 80s. My wife and I watched it. It was like a miniseries of various stories that were done particularly well. I mean, they added various things, but the things they added made a lot of sense for the most part. And, so I compared that to the one they just put out, where Father Brown's basically absolutely ecumenical and approving all religions and non-judgmental on anyone. And I think Chesterton did it just right in the book. He deals with people who are not Catholic regularly, and yet he doesn't compromise the Catholic faith. He's charitable to everyone he deals with, but he's not compromising the faith as he goes about solving these various stories and whatnot.
Yeah, and now in the new version, he's a fully synodal thinker,
right?
All about accompanying and dialogue and everything else,
right?
But only with certain groups. If he were to have an episode come by and all of a sudden he comes by a traditional parish, he wouldn't accompany them.
No, an SSPX chapel.
Yeah. So last thought. So we talked about Catholic themes in Lord of the Rings and how well, of course, these original films did work. Oftentimes, when we go looking for Catholic films, religious films, a lot of the time they stink. Movies on saints, you're just like, what did I just watch? And I'm not even talking about like your brother, sun, sister, moon type of thing. It's just like you'd watch this movie, or you have. Well, I mean, you expect it with Hollywood, like that Joan of Arc movie that Hollywood did a few years back. That was she just looked like a schizophrenic psychopath. Mm-hmm. I think was it Mila Jovovich as Joan of Arc. I can't remember.
I mean, it's Hollywood trying to smear Snape. So
but even when Catholic companies pick it up, it's just a lot of times it just falls flat. And so I've always had this great idea for how to make a film on St. John Fisher. Right there in all the bits of the Tudor court. He's a reforming bishop. He's a take no nonsense kind of bishop. He's in the middle of all these incredible great events. So much working with Thomas More. It'd just be amazing if you make a film about him. There's so many other saints. Francis Xavier, good grief, you could make such an incredible film about Francis Xavier.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me.
Saint Ignatius. You could make a great film about Saint Ignatius and have it be be a commentary about what Ignatian spirituality actually is versus where it is now.
There was a Filipino group that did a halfway decent job. The practical effects were a bit lacking, and the CGI was low budget. But for all that, it was about his early life. It's just about as he ends up in Salamanca in the trials he has there before he can go to Paris. I don't know. Did you see it, Anthony? It was just called was it just Ignacio de Loyola, or something like that. I got to look it up. I saw it in the theater a couple years ago when it came out, and generally it wasn't too bad, and it showed his spiritual struggles, becoming what he was. I gotta find that. I know. So
it's amazing because it's amazing how old Hollywood was somehow actually able to do really good Catholic stories.
There's that Fatima movie from the 50s, The Bells of St. Mary's. Beckett is the classic example.
Song of Bernadette, Man for All Seasons. I mean, it's just amazing how many, like when you look back and you say, Hollywood used to do films like this.
Well, let me put it to you this way. It's gotten so bad that people now debate whether Nacho Libre was a Catholic movie or not.
Oh boy.
If you've seen that,
I'm familiar with it.
Oh goodness.
It's based on a true story, actually. So which is what the confusing thing.
Yeah, because nowadays, you're getting, even back in 2008, you get films like Doubt. There was one film from the last 5 years called, I think it was
Silence.
Ida. Silence is one. I have a weird relationship with Silence.
I wasn't interested because movie celebrated a priest apostatizing essentially, and a lot of, like, I knew some South American missionaries who ran the Newman Center at my university who really celebrated that movie, but I was reading some, more harder line reviews of it saying, no, they're celebrating a priest apostatizing.
Right.
The
first two acts of the movie were phenomenal.
Yeah.
And then you get to the final act, and then these priests apostatize, and it's one of the things. It's like the movie's fighting itself in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It's Martin Scorsese doing a movie about the faith. I mean, come on. I mean,
exactly.
I've seen The Last Temptation of Christ, and I've seen, I saw it before I was Catholic, so I didn't quite understand it. And then I remember it now, and I know, like, Scorsese, as soon as you hear him saying, I'm going to do a Catholic movie, you immediately should at that point just wash your hands.
Run.
And again, exactly. because this is where, there's always y'all have a, I always love the show, the unpops.
Right on the rundown.
Yeah, exactly. Like I actually like The Last Temptation of Christ. I think if you go into it with a specific understanding, I think that there is I think that as a general film, I think it's terrible because the general audiences are not going to be able to kind of like look at it in the way.
That's the problem. It's a very nuanced film that most people are like. People don't pick up on nuances in modern films.
Yes.
Right. Like, if you understand that movie as this is what the devil tempted Christ with to try to get him off the cross at the end. I'm not going to endorse the movie, but if that's what he was going for, then okay, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt that that's what he was going for, even if the execution was Jaws 3D bad. But like,
I just love the last sequence because of how it ends, and then also the song. I don't know. Scorsese has his magic in certain films with having really great songs at the end, like that help to bring about emotions. Like, to me, still one of the greatest endings of any film ever is Gangs of New York. Like, just like the way in which everything is transitioning with the music and everything. But I go back to okay, so there was that. So I go back to one of his more recent films. So like I'll actually go to bat for films like Silence and Last Temptation, just because if you go, I go into those films with a specific understanding, and so I appreciate, like, there's certain elements of the story that I appreciate. But then I go to a more recent film that he did, the one he did on Netflix, which was just I forget what it was called, with De Niro and Pesci were back together. I forget. I forget what it was called, but he had Father James Martin in the film. And not only did he have Father James Martin in the film, not only did he have Father James Martin in the film, Father James Martin was a pre-Vatican II priest, saying and he was doing a baptism in Latin, and the Latin was like, I'm not even a Latin expert.
It was terrible. It was terrible.
I was listening to it. I was like, this guy's never said Latin before in his life. This guy, it's just insane.
Here's the Ignacio de Loyola. The
don't make priests learn Latin
movie, by the way. Here's the trailer for it, if you indulge me on that.
The one you said would look good.
This is a Filipino movie?
Yes, with European actors.
Oh, okay. I was going to say.
Or American actors.
Seems to be a silent movie as well.
Or he muted it for copyright reasons.
Yeah, true.
No, I mean, visually it looks good. I saw somebody in the chat saying Paul Apostle of Christ was good. I actually I didn't like Paul Apostle of Christ. I liked all the scenes with Jim Caviezel and the actor playing St. Paul. I liked all those scenes. But isn't it thought that St. Paul and St. Peter were in Rome at about the same time, or at least there was some overlap? Like, I had an issue because there was no reference at all to Peter or Clement or whoever the Bishop of Rome would have been. And since the whole movie seemed to revolve around a big conflict in the Christian community, you would have thought that St. Paul would have said, hey, let's go ask the bishop. And that never happened once in the film. And I thought that was a giant oversight. And I know why the filmmakers did it, because the filmmakers were Catholic. That's because most of the people who saw the movie were not going to be Catholic. And that's why they didn't bring Peter in, because there are a whole group of Protestants, a very large group of Protestants, who believe, adamantly that Peter never made it to Rome. Because if Peter made it to Rome, then they have a big problem on their hands in rejecting the Catholic Church. So they say Peter never got to Rome. And yeah, so I have issues with that movie. Although, again, Jim Caviezel and St. Paul's scenes together were magic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would there was a really good shout because I remember seeing it once. A lot of people have been saying the film For Greater Glory about the Cristeros. I actually thought that was actually a pretty well made film too.
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah.
It was good. My only complaint about For Greater Glory was that they introduced too many characters, and it was hard to keep track. So, like with the whole side of the League for the Defense of Religious Liberty, or whatever they called it in the film, in actuality, it was the defense of the religion, and they meant the Catholic Church, and that's what the League was about, not mere American style religious liberty. So but they have that group, and there's not a whole lot that they do is one of the problems, and so you have that kind of taking away from screen time from the main story, which is more along the side of the Cristeros, and that's what it made it hard for me to follow all the characters, although they did focus on the most important characters, and they did give them a good deal of time. But there are more stories that could have been told in that, and they also hit it. I mean, I think they had to, because nobody would have underwritten it if they didn't do this. But they hid the hand coming from this country that was pushing for a lot of those events.
That's kind of a major detail to leave out of the movie. I mean,
right.
The Mexican government couldn't have done half of what it did without the U.S. government support.
And they make it look like the U.S. or the Knights of Columbus are begging the U.S. government to do something. So a U.S. ambassador's down asking Calles to kind of back off and make a deal, make everybody happy. Whereas in reality, it was the Roosevelt administration was pushing what was going on there. And before him, it was kind of U.S. government policy to destabilize the Catholic Church in Mexico. So, but you have to hide that away. You can't talk about that because and of course the Masonic element too. We don't dare put that into a movie, you crazy conspiracy theorist. So that one's never, they never would have been able to eat. As it was, they had a difficult time making the movie and distributing it because, a lot of people didn't want to distribute it.
Mm-hmm. I was surprised because I know what part of the country you live in, and I'm surprised you were able to see that in a theater because I can't imagine you had a lot of options for that.
Right. No, we did actually in Coeur d'Alene. They had it, and but here's the fun part. So I go to see a whole bunch of people from all the traditional churches out here. A whole bunch of us went to see it because we wanted to make sure to fill up all the seats in that to show the support for it, right? And the previews were the filthiest, most perverted previews they could possibly have thrown in that movie. Not just one, but like 3 or 4. It's like this is not an accident. That was not done by accident.
No, it's sort of like 9 out of 10 ads on my YouTube channel are pretty bland, but then you get that one that's not, and people complain about it. But if all my ads were like that, it would be, I would know that they were doing it on purpose, right?
Right. This is the only thing I think of would be, because I think For Greater Glory, was that a PG-13 film?
If they showed an execution of the priest, they probably got a PG-13 for that.
Yeah. I think, right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was, but I'd have to.
Yeah, because that's the only thing I can think of is that the only way it would have been having any type of shield from any type of risque, even PG-13 trailers would be if it had gotten a PG rating. Because they basically will always match those things up. But as far as films, I guess to kind of look forward to, I'd posted it. Obviously, I think I assume we're all looking forward to.
Oh, no, it was rated R.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, there you go. That's why. I'll say that's probably why then.
Right.
Because that's the only way that they can get those R trailers in is in
R-rated movies. So that's how it happened. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. And there we are.
That makes a lot more sense then.
So you said we're all looking forward to what?
I would assume, because obviously Mel Gibson coming out with the sequel to The Passion of the Christ. I think that there's a lot to be excited for there.
Yeah. We'll see.
Yeah.
Some movies don't need a sequel, And Acts of the Apostles doesn't often translate to the screen too well for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Although he's only going to focus on the first 4 chapters of Acts, isn't he? That's what he said.
I think he's doing what similar to where he's going to borrow certain things from some mystics as well. I know that I want to say early on there was a talk about him doing the harrowing of hell, which is something I'm really looking forward to see how that plays out.
Hopefully he's got a budget to do that justice then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I will tell you, I hated the Fatima movie.
Yeah.
I mean, their hell scene was a joke. And
Yeah,
the whole
the
lack
budget
of
was-
call to repentance, that movie
Mhm.
kind of played down the whole repentance thing. Pray the rosary, not mentioned at all. And the hell sequence was disturbing in that in the Fatima message, you have a description of, snows or souls falling like snowflakes into hell, right?
Mhm.
That was not what that hell scene looked like in that movie. So I'm hoping that
It was green screen CGI, just did not.
Right.
it's not even like the quality of the CGI, it's the lack of like being faithful to the message, right? And so if he's going to do the harrowing of hell, I really hope he gets he does it well, that he handles it properly and doesn't spend most of his CGI budget just de-aging Jim Caviezel. Because, it's been almost 20 years.
Caviezel still looks pretty good, I will say.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a current picture of him, so
Yeah.
He does the rounds giving talks,
okay.
pushing Medjugorje and giving talks. So
I would still imagine him like in the Count of Monte Cristo, but
the most recent thing I saw him in was Person of Interest, if you ever saw that.
okay. I've been told by a number of people that was good. I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, it's definitely one of those 2000s, mid 2000s era, post 9/11, sort of intelligence agents go rogue and fight bad guys kind of shows.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's good. It's weirdly prescient though, because the whole thing revolves around a Skynet type thing, and given what we're living through now, that actually is a weirdly prescient thing. So I'd say it's okay if you can, handle, Jim Caviezel doing kung fu violence on people. And this is post Passion of the Christ, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? So he was like, living faithful Catholic when he made the show.
Were y'all able to check out that trailer of Father Stew that just dropped with Mel Gibson and Mark Wahlberg? Because that also looks like it might have some potential there. Yeah, it's about a former fighter who becomes a priest, and so it's gonna deal with a lot of very specific Catholic elements.
It sounds like are you familiar with Saint Moses the Black?
I've heard the name, but I don't know much about.
He was I believe a desert father sort of, and he had been a brigand and had a radical conversion and went to live with some monks, and he ended up laying down his life for the monastery when another group of brigands tried to attack the monastery.
Oh wow!
His life would make a cool movie.
Yeah,
yeah, it would be a fantastic movie
if done right.
Yes. Yeah. The caveat to all of these, right?
and we'd fill the diversity quotas because they're Black and Middle Eastern. So I mean, there we go.
Yeah,
perfect.
It'd be eligible for being nominated for Best Picture based on the new rules that are going into it.
Well, they'd have to insert an alphabet character in there, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, that's right.
You wouldn't be able to get away without it.
Maybe they'll make a modern version of it, and he takes shelter with the Jesuits, and that'll take care of the whole problem.
Yeah, no kidding. So I guess to conclude, we've been on for a while. I guess so. With the next Lord of the Rings or the next Tolkien series that's going to come out, we've kind of given our predictions how bad it's going to be. Hopefully, like I know I expect the worst, but I hope to be absolutely wrong and that it's going to be the most wonderful thing that ever came out. I truly hope, but I don't have a lot of confidence in that. I don't know about anybody else. Ultimately, I guess what would be kind of your closing remarks about the net effect of the original trilogy?
For me, the original trilogy has always been very personal. Because I mentioned this in the beginning. My dad read The Hobbit to me and my brothers when we were growing up, and he also read the Lord of the Rings as well, and did all the voices and everything. And so one of the special things was when the films first started coming out was when I was in middle school, and then going into high school is when the last one came out. And so I was able to watch those with my siblings and also with my dad. And so it was kind of like a bonding experience. And we'd be able to, when those came out on DVD for the first time, continue to watch them over and over. And it was able to remind us of those times of him reading those stories to us. And so it's always been a personal story for me, and that's why I'm so glad now to be able to go back. You know, as I mentioned, I'm rewatching them right now, the extended editions. You know, with my new 4K TV, so I can actually like see the work that they put in, and they have put in so much work into it. And so I just love all these extra details that are being added in. Also, I've been loving this entire discussion because now it just makes me want to even more so dive into the books as well. Both the Lord of the Rings trilogy and also Silmarillion, etc., to get the fuller context, because I think there's just, as you said, right, and as we've been saying, there's so much rich Christian imagery that can be found in these accounts. And so for me, the original trilogy means so much because of that personal connection with the experiences that I had, just again with the way my dad introduced the stories to us, and every time we watch it together.
I remember when those movies came out, there was a controversy when the second one was on its way out. The name of the movie was The Two Towers, and it was coming out after 9/11. And those films had an interesting effect because while they're pretty dark films, they're also very hopeful films.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember they lifted spirits for people at a time when they desperately needed them. And we're in a similar time period now, except you're not going to get that from Amazon. I can't see it happening. They are the poster child for soulless mega corporations, maybe after Meta, right? So, but that's what those films did, is they gave people hope when they needed it, when people were living through a very dark, stressful period. And it would be wonderful if we could get that again. I just don't see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I tend to agree. Especially that, I mean, it was personal for me. It was helpful, like I mentioned earlier. It was helpful at a difficult period of my life. But you know, with it is really that the note of hope is really strong in those movies, and even beyond that, there's like a clear, you know, black and white. There's this is evil, and this is good. This is the path that's going to lead to just darkness. It's going to make everything fall apart. This is the path that's going to fix things. That's going to at least give everyone a chance to be free, to do the good, right? And this is not the magical MacGuffin that's going to make us live happily ever after. This is the right path that we should be taking. And you have that wonderful line, and they put this line in the films very wonderfully. All you have to do is to decide what to do with the time that's given to you. And I think, and that's the most perfect line. And like I mentioned earlier, when you delve into fantasy, you basically take a trip there, and you come back to the real world. And this is why, of course, my always prevailing criticism is cutting the scarring of the Shire out of the last chapter. I know some people think it had to be done, but this is really where the books all come together for Tolkien. Is that, you know, they've stepped into the world of giants. They've stepped into the world of wizards and elves, dark lords, rings of power, and so many things. And now they're coming out of that. You know, a king has now been, you know, restored, and then they come back into the Shire, and it's a mess because all the effects of what was, you know, going on here. Now you came back into the real world, and you have problems to solve, and you're going to take what you learned on that journey and solve your problems. Now it was something new, more or less, that's, you know, fixed into you, hopefully. And that's more or less the hobbits themselves have been more or less on this little escapist journey, even though it's not exactly fun because of all the suffering they had to go through. And now they have to take what they learned on this adventure and apply it to save their home, right? And in a real sense, we have to do that too in real life. You come back out of reading. I had this idea for some silly little trailer a long time ago where to just give this scene of like a great warrior fighting with his sword through all these hurdles and obstacles, and then he has to destroy this big bad goblin of some sort. And then at the very end, there's like a woman handing him a child, and he looks at it. Now the whole scene changes, and he's holding a child, and his wife and goes to sleep on the couch. And family, take the adventure, right? It just I hope somebody makes that into some little ad to put on YouTube somewhere. But it's because that very much is why you go to literature, why you read fantasy. And I think in the movies, in spite of any criticisms I have about them, they really help you do that. You see what people have done in really hopeless, frankly, situations, and come out better for it. And that's and if there's any note that we need in the world today, especially, it's hope.
But
Amen.
don't you place your hope in earthly princes? I know that's big right now in our circles.
Right. Oh boy. Yeah. And, Orange Man, or whatever.
Isn't it Florida Man now is going to be the one who saves us? I don't know. I have a hard time keeping track of this stuff.
Save us from the alligators. All right. So real quick, Odin, first time on the channel. Tell everyone about what you do and where they can find more of your work.
Yeah, you can find me at OMB Reviews on YouTube. I also upload to Odyssey as well. It's a backup, but I also like to promote them as an alt tech platform. They are very much freedom of speech oriented. I talk about movies, pop culture. I also have a very heavy focus on the box office. I do box office breakdowns and just talk about the general numbers as they were. Even though I'm not a math person, I just have become a math person. It's just something that's naturally happened with the progression of the channel. But I also have live streams twice a week, every Tuesday and Saturday, and I usually in those streams do movie talks. But usually faith is always bringing up and coming up in the discussion. And I have a second channel actually that I really would like to spend more time with when summer comes around, called the OMB Report, where I look at news stories, but I look at them from a independent Catholic, traditional Catholic perspective. So you can check out the OMB Report, but I'm not putting as much content there. But also my website, ombReviews.com. So just, again, if you like films and numbers and things like that, you can find reviews there and box office charting and all that good stuff. And it's been great being invited on to join. This is kind of one of those moments where for me, I'm like, oh, these are people I listen to all the time, and I get to do a stream with them. I've been fanboying for quite a bit. So thank you for inviting me on. It's been fun.
No, same actually for me, as I see you on Friday Night Tights.
Yeah.
When I can manage to catch it, because it's so long I have to break it up during the week. But and then likewise on your own channel. So yeah, it was great to have you on, Dr. Stine.
I'm over at Return to Tradition. I'm really bad at self-promotion. I'm actually really awful at self-promotion. But
Oops.
Daily uploads, weekend semi-educational stuff. The driest stuff that people don't like. It's on the weekends. So,
but really good stuff. Really good stuff in there.
Really good stuff. And hopefully we'll be back again to get this trio together to talk about more faith in film and pop culture. So thank you all for joining us, and God bless and keep you all.